Cool. So today we are going to do part two of critiques, talking about their structure and the relation to the story. This should be pretty quick because we've already talked about a lot of this, and it's pretty similar to stuff you've already heard. So the three parts of the critique structure are the link, impact, and alternative. And just like with the counterplan, the permutation is going to be part of this. But since we already went over that and it's not very different for critiques, we're not going to spend a lot of time on it. So what's a critique link? How is it different from other links? Just like with the disad, we're trying to show that if the plan happens or if the judge votes for the plan, it's going to cause some unforeseen consequences that the affirmative didn't talk about in their 1AC. So you want to bring them up in the 1NC in your first negative speech. So a critique link shows how the affirmative plan has problematic underlying values. Remember, the underlying values are the ideas about why the plan should get passed. What's the justification for it? The link is going to set up why the plan would justify more harmful outcomes to happen, which is the impact, and how we can move away from the harmful thinking in the plan, which is the alternative. So the link sets up the rest of the critique. And the link also generally identifies one problematic way of the thinking that the affirmative has. So instead of talking about sexism and racism and classism and all these other isms, it usually just chooses one and it says, listen, here is how this plan relates to this problematic ism that it is causing. And it could be a thing that the plan does that there's a link to, or it could be language that the plan uses to justify the plan that causes the link to this problematic thing, right? And we see that in real life all the time, where there's something that maybe is a good idea in general, but the person advocating for it, trying to justify it, is using language that is like really outdated or problematic in some way. And as a result, you see that that plan itself is also problematic too, or could be problematic. So the link establishes why the underlying values are a problem or something that the judge should reject, right? And then the impact takes it a step further. So the impact says why those underlying values are a really problematic thing, what they justify that could cause other problems that the judge should not want to do, right? So for example, if a plan has racist underlying values, that's the link, then passing the plan or endorsing the plan would justify racism. It would be one step of supporting racism. And since racism is bad, even if you think the plan itself maybe is a good idea, would have good outcomes, if it justifies this thing that is really abhorrent, that's really bad, then maybe we can go without the plan as long if it's worth rejecting that very bad thing, right? So critique impacts tend to be relatively large, but not specific, right? If you're saying why racism is bad, you could give thousands of hours of explanation about why that's true. But in the 4 minutes you have in debate, you don't have enough time to go all the way into why racism is bad, right? So for critiques, since they're talking about something relatively large and complicated, ultimately you're going to have to boil it down to a pretty simple explanation, and you're not going to be able to go super in depth. So, and that's okay. We don't do that in any part of debate, right? Even when you're talking about your plan, you sort of take something that's really, really complicated that could have a lot of consequences, and you boil it down to a more generalized thing that we can actually debate adequately on both sides. So it's not like this only happens in critiques, this happens everywhere. But in critiques, you might have a really good understanding, or you might have a strong feeling about why the impact is true. In this case, why racism is bad. And I think debaters tend to get into this mode where they talk about how bad the impact is when everyone in the room already agrees with them, right? Like if you get up and say racism is bad for 4 minutes, it's not like the other team's going to get up and disagree with you. They're just going to say, okay, racism is bad, but we don't link to it. We don't cause racism, or the alternative won't solve, or something like that, right? So impact is important, but in your debates, try not to get too hung up about, over explaining it. And then the third part is the alternative. So the alternative is something you want the judge to do or endorse or agree with that is opposed to the underlying values of the plan. So just like with the counter plan, we don't want the affirmative to be able to say that the alternative and the plan can be done together, that they can be permuted. So what you have to do as the negative is you have to show that the alternative is something that's really different from the underlying values of the plan and really different from the plan itself. And also, you can use your link arguments to show why the alternative and the plan can't be done together. Because if it's true that the link is true, that the plan really does have these problematic underlying values, and if your alternative really is something against those underlying values, then logically they can't really be done together. They don't go together, right? So you should have no problem making the alternative argument if you've made sure that your link arguments are really good. And then here's just one final note about critiques to help you think about them. Critiques are sort of like a disadvantage, but without the uniqueness, and also plus a counter plan. So you have a link and an impact, like you have in a disadvantage, and they're basically the same, except that you're looking at underlying values instead of the actual plan itself. And you have an alternative to the plan, something that you want the judge to do instead of the plan, which is the same as the alternative, right? So the counter plan and the alternative are kind of similar things, which might make you say, why is there no uniqueness in a critique? Well, think about the story you're telling with a critique, right? In a critique, you're saying this plan has these problematic underlying values. And if you think these underlying values are bad, you should not justify the plan, right? That you should not vote for the plan because it justifies bad things. So, for example, if the plan has racist underlying values, it doesn't matter that racism already exists in the status quo, right? Even if racism exists now, you do not want to increase the amount of racism that exists. So the uniqueness for critiques doesn't really matter as long as we all agree that the impact to the critique is true, right? If racism is bad, it doesn't matter if racism is going on a lot or a little or whatever right now. We just agree that if the link is true, then the plan increases the amount of racism being done or justified, and therefore that's a bad thing. So if that doesn't quite make sense yet, you don't need to worry about it too much because there's no uniqueness arguments or anything in the packet, but this is just to help you to understand how critiques work. So I hope this was pretty straightforward. I don't think this is too complicated, and as we get to the evidence, I think this will also make a lot more sense. So please watch the evidence video that comes next, and please watch the strategy video after that, and we'll get into this a little more deeply. In the meantime, talk with your partner, talk with your coach, and make sure you feel like you have a good handle on this, and we'll talk more.